I'm here with a couple friends. I have a friend, Dave Daly from Killen's College, a colleague with me, one of the more integrous guys that I've met. And if you get the chance to meet him, and if you don't want to go into the real world and you want to continue on to grad school, then you should talk to him when you continue. Vince Baycoat is a good friend over there, and who brought me out to speak tonight on the myth of equality. And so what I'm going to do this morning is kind of lay a bit of a foundation, but tonight I want to get into that book and to talk about race and privilege. And it's a tricky conversation to have sometimes. I was at a Christian college not too long ago. I had been contacted by a chaplain, and he wanted to ask me, as a white man in his late 20s, how to navigate some of the things he was struggling with, dealing with. And we had a very long conversation, and he said, would you come out to the college's chapel? And I said, great, I'd love to do that. We could probably even talk about some of this stuff. And he said, no, we can't do that. And I said, why? He said, well, the president has forbade that the words white privilege ever be spoken from our stage. And I said to him, if we can't talk in the classrooms and on the main stages at Christian colleges about what we're talking about in society and about what you're talking about in your dorm rooms, then where are we going to have deep conversations as Christians, right? So I love the opportunity to talk about, I think, a very complex, nuanced thing, and to wrap our minds around it and see what it means for Christian discipleship, to try and walk into an understanding of the mosaic that God has created and what equity and equality might actually look like as we own our history as Christians in this country, and as we lay hold of the opportunities that come with various forms of privilege that we have today. I think the world is longing to see that. So I'm looking forward to that tonight. And I've also got a friend and mentor in the room. So Sandra Van Opstel has been somebody that has helped me grow in my journey as I continue to wrestle through what faith looks like as it intersects with culture in all its various forms. So it's kind of a fun thing. I'm also in a crazy transition week this week. I begin a new job this Friday night. I planted a church in Bend, Oregon called Antioch years ago. But we're relocating to the greater Portland area in Beaverton to a church called Village, which is a multicultural church. Been on that kind of experiment for the last 30 years. And there's something very different between a multicultural church and a multi-ethnic church, or just simply a church that cares about diversity. Multicultural means you're taking the different ethnicities, the different people groups, and trying to give value to and expression to the different languages and cultures that they bring, not just bringing a bunch of people of racial or ethnic diversity in and being monoculture with regard to how we do church, kind of the more contemporary way that we're familiar with from the church growth movement, if you will. The church growth movement was a beautiful thing for growing large churches, but it required a homogeneity that allowed you to move fast. There's an old African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. There's something about all being like one another in an echo chamber that allows for kind of a unity and going fast in a certain direction. But I think we miss something about the beauty of the kingdom of God that is expressed through people that come from different places, speak different languages, have different experiences from the way they've grown up, and how they bring that to our common fellowship and experience as believers and allow us to see things that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. So I'm excited about kind of my new adventure and what that'll look like. But I want to just give you a little bit of background about me and then kind of go into what I'm going to call a theology of justice. And I had something happen right before I came up that has never happened to me, and that's somebody who was born and raised in right near the town in Holland where I have my earliest memories. So Tim is from an area called The Hague in Holland, or the lower part of the Netherlands, right by a little town called Leiderdorp, which is where I lived from 3 till about 7. So all of my earliest childhood memories are European ones. I didn't realize that till like a couple years ago, but they're all European memories. I also spoke fluent Dutch, which is interesting because my parents, when we came back to the States, were really worried about my English. So my dad, being kind of a Dutchman and an immigrant and a very focused guy, forbade me from speaking any Dutch in the home so that my English would improve. And 2 years later, he went to speak something to me, And I had absolutely no clue what he was saying. So in other words, if you're thinking of a 7-year-old, you're very articulate, right? That was me with the Dutch language. In 2 years, it completely went away. So I'm the only person I know that once was bilingual and now isn't. And I give my dad a hard time about that, and his response, very practical response is, so you can't speak a language that's only spoken in a very small country where everyone speaks English anyways. To which I tell him he's missing the point. In the Netherlands, English isn't a second language, it's 1.5, I've learned. Nobody got that. The problem with dry humor, my wife tells me, is that half the time it's actually not funny. So you'll have to have some grace with me. But so I come by my last name honestly. My dad was born in 1944 in what was Nazi-occupied Holland, the Netherlands, and he immigrated when he was 8, but I grew up with the stories of that time about my grandfather dressing up like a woman because he was hiding underneath the stairs. They had come and taken all the able-bodied men to go work in factories, and so my grandfather would dress up like a woman, ride a bike into the countryside when my grandmother was too pregnant to be able to go forage for food. Food was very scarce, as the soldiers would kind of take everything that was available. And after the war, you have stories of people eating tulip bulbs and different kinds of things. It was just a very difficult time. And so my dad became an immigrant when he was about age 8. It was on a boat, sailed across the ocean, past the Statue of Liberty, past Ellis Island, which was closed in the 40s, and to a town called Hoboken, New Jersey, which is kind of right on the edge across from Ellis Island, and there's a train depot there. And they got on a train, went to Pasadena, California with just $20 in their pocket, and kind of started that way. The reason that's kind of interesting is when I was about the age of my dad when he was an immigrant, we lived in the Bay Area. My dad had joined the Navy when he was going to college to pay for college, and so I grew up kind of bouncing around every 2 to 3 years. But we were in the Bay Area in the late 70s, and my dad came home on a Tuesday night, and he said, I need you to pack up your room and kind of move in to a different part of the house because we're going to have guests this weekend. And I didn't really know what was going on. But sure enough, that Saturday we went to the airport and we picked up a family of 5, not quite a family. It was a husband and a wife and their child, and then a brother and a sister. And they had gotten put together. They were a Cambodian family. They'd gotten put together in a Thai refugee camp. And my parents had sponsored them to come live with us. Back then, in those days, as a refugee, you had to have a sponsor to kind of come in. And they had fled the genocide that had happened all through the 70s in Cambodia under Pol Pot or the Khmer Rouge regime. If you want to learn more about that, watch the movie The Killing Fields. But they had escaped to Thailand and then came and lived with us. And my whole life changed in that moment. And it was the sights, and it was the smells, it was the sounds, it was everything. And Foy Long, the father, sat down that first day. They didn't speak any English, and he wrote a letter to my dad that my dad still has, a one-page letter talking about their experience and about boys with guns and people eating people. Just the starvation that existed in that country is about half the population died over that period of time. And so I had, in kind of my formative years, 8, 9, 10, this experience of having a family living with us and watching my parents give up their weekends to help them go through naturalization, get driver's license, English as second language, find first jobs, find first place to rent or live. And they're still in our lives today. When my wife and I got married, Moikir, the mother, came and she gave us our biggest financial gift at our wedding. Not because she's rich by any stretch, but because she was, in a lot of ways, I think, honoring my parents and what they had done for her. But what that did in me, kind of at a young age, was awaken this understanding of the other, or this idea of empathy. And so at age 22, when I got really serious about my Christian faith and started reading the Bible, it was the justice passages, the love passages, the orphan, the widow, and the alien, or the poor, the quartet of the vulnerable, it's been called. Those passages really made sense to me. It's that the Creator would care for His creation, or those He has created, just really made sense to me. And so as I went into seminary, I went to study philosophy of religion and ethics. That's kind of the field where you can get into moral philosophy and kind of the history of justice, if you will. And then I went on and kind of studied biblical studies and really wanted to explore this concept of justice. And so that's kind of been the quest I've been on for a long time. And it's a lifelong project because there's always something that you begin to realize you've been blind to and that you need to grow in. And so for me, the last 7 or 8 years, it's really come back to the domestic stuff in the United States and becoming more and more aware of the history and of kind of the structural things that kind of are grooved into our society. As Christians, we're really good about compassion, which is kind of like feather dusting the top, if you will. We're not really good at sinking deep into the grooves that have been etched by some of the sinfulness or the hatred that has marked different parts of our history. And so justice requires that we would do for other people what we'd want them to do for us, which is to lean into the actual things that make life not what it ought to be, not shalom, not where we can flourish as human beings. But the ethics part of justice, I think, is the easier one. It's the one we talk about most. And so in John 15, out of the passage we read, I want to kind of just use this as a jumping off point. It says, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Now remain in my love. And if you keep my commands, you will remain in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commands and remain in his love." The interesting thing, this passage uses the word love, but biblically speaking, there's a whole cluster of words that get at this idea of justice or peace, what is shalom, if you will, or sacrificial love of the other. And so there's kind of this cluster concept. In fact, if you go to Leviticus 19, where Jesus is quoting from, when he says, "Love your neighbor as yourself," it's actually not a command, love your neighbor as yourself. In Leviticus 19, it's a summation statement. In other words, the whole chapter is a chapter on social justice and criminal justice. And then you get to this point where the writer takes all of that and boils it together and simply states, love your neighbor as yourself. And when Jesus grabs that summation statement, he's intending to bring with it all of what that kind of summarized, this idea that we would pursue a right relationship with God, self, others, and creation, which is another way of saying justice. Justice is about a right relationship with God, self, others, and creation, or that it would bring about a state of affairs as it ought to be, the way God designed the world to be. We get a little bit hung up on the word justice in American society, not as much in your generation, but in older generations, because we have this kind of criminal justice bent when we hear the word justice, but actually that's just the word justice with a modifier in front of it, an adjective. If you had a pie and you looked at a slice, certainly one of those slices would be criminal justice, the area where we talk about law and order and things like that. But you would also have a slice about international justice. So equity between two sovereign nations, or business law and ethics, where we're talking about in corporate life, what does it mean to deal with people fairly? And if you get to the issue of immigration or refugees or the poor in society, then that little slice would be social justice, justice in society. In fact, it was a Catholic priest that first coined the phrase social justice back in 1848. So we need to think more broadly of this idea of justice. But we come to the ethics part of justice, the doing, the works part, really naturally. I want to say there's another dimension, which is the with Godness, or our understanding of God, a theology of justice that we kind of get here. That somehow our understanding of love, or our leaning hard into God's heart for his creation, justice, tells us something more about God than we would know otherwise. So Jeremiah 22, if you turn there quickly, if you don't want to, I'll read it. But it's this fascinating judgment passage where God is judging the bad king Shallum. And it says this is what the Lord says about Shallum, son of Josiah. So Josiah was a good king, and here he's got this son that's not following in his ways. He will never return. This is the judgment against Shallum. He will die in the place where they have led him captive, and he will not see this land again. Woe to him who builds his palace by unrighteousness, his upper rooms by injustice. In fact, that's Hebrew parallelism. Righteousness and justice are synonyms. In the English language, when we started translating the Bible in the 15 and 1600s into the English language, these two words, righteousness and justice, were used to define and expand on the same space. If you look at a Spanish Bible, it's just one of those two words. It's justicia. Or the Latin, or even I'm told in the French, that they just have the broad, robust concept of justice, not these two that we have of righteousness and justice. That's important, by the way, because I run into a lot of people that say justice is an okay thing, but you have to keep it at a tertiary level. You can't let it sneak into our understanding of the gospel. And to that I say we can't understand the gospel without reference to justice language. And they say that's heresy. The gospel, the good news, Jesus' atonement is just about righteousness. You can't sneak in this justice language. And so when I argue with pastors like this, eventually I'll switch to a weird form of sarcasm because that works in argumentation. And I'll pretend that they've won me over by their argument. And I'll say, I think I understand where you're coming from. I think you've got me. Let me tell you what I'm hearing you say, and then you tell me if I get it right. And they're like, okay. And so I'll say to them, the gospel is that Jesus came and he died so that unjust people could stand next to a just God as if they're just through a process of justification whereby we're justified. But it has nothing to do with any justice language. Am I hearing you right? You see, brothers and sisters, it's always been there. We just haven't had the eyes to see how close and intricately connected in the news, the good news that's going on in and through us with Jesus Christ, how much that borrows from this idea of justice, right? So we get righteousness and justice as kind of synonyms. The bad king is making his people work for nothing, not paying them for their labor. And he says, I will build myself a great palace with spacious upper rooms. So I put large windows in it, panel it with cedar and decorate it in red. And now God says, does it make you a king to have more and more cedar? Did not your father have food and drink? He did what was right and just, and so all went well with him. In fact, Habakkuk in the King James and New King James doesn't say the righteous will live by their faith. It says the just will live by their faith. It's supposed to mean the same thing, that if you're willing to give your life away for the sake of the kingdom, if you're willing to give your life away for others, sooner or later you get to a point where you're kind of like, how is this going to work out for me? Everyone else, all my friends that are looking out for themselves and getting ahead, like, how am I going to keep up with that when I keep giving my life away? How is this going to work out? And the answer is we do it on faith that God has promised when we live a just life, that he somehow will take care of us in that. The just will live by their faith. This is what God is pointing to, and he says, your father did what was right, and he had food and drink. In other words, I took care of him, and you should have seen that in your dad's example. And then it continues, and it says, he defended the cause of the poor and needy, and so all went well with him. And then God asks provocatively, is that not what it means to know me, declares the Lord. Now, why is that so important? If justice was just an ethical category or conversation, then what God would have said, should have said here is that not what it means to obey me? Instead, God says, is that not what it means to know me? Do you guys have a philosophy department here? Wait, any philosophers? So epistemology, what's the study of epistemology? Somebody? Knowledge. So the study of how you know something, what you know, whether it constitutes justified true belief, but it's basically this kind of knowledge study. And so justice is certainly ethical. It's also epistemological. Or another way of saying it is it's theological. It's theos and logos. It's the study of God. It's what we know about God, how we know God. It's spiritual growth stuff. And so justice, coming to understand God's heart for people, is learning a bit of his character and thereby coming to know our God that much more. It's a knowledge category, not just an obedience category. Does that make sense? So in our churches, justice just shouldn't be for like the missions committee. We should read certainly A.W. Tozer and The Knowledge of the Holy or something like that, but justice books belong in our spiritual growth small groups as much as they do in kind of our works small groups. The third category, because we're moving along pretty quick, is that justice is also deeply existential. It's got an existential component to it. John 15, Jesus says, remain with the Father, that closeness. Again, by the way, Isaiah 58 is the theological part. That what I really want is not your clamoring to know me, but I want you to act with other people in a certain way. That's where intimacy is going to be found. Matthew 25, where Jesus says, whatever you do for one of the least of these, you do for me. Psalm 9:16, the Lord is known by his justice. This is no small thing. We've done the ethical part of justice for so long, we don't realize that it's a foundation stone, justice, that's a cube. And it has three other sides that need to be studied and explored. And if we don't do that, we end up with a really thin kind of soil that we can't root ourselves in, and certainly can't hold up the more robust conversations like what we're going to talk about tonight. Instead, what we end up doing is compartmentalizing and hyper-spiritualizing our faith and just taking all of the messy parts of reality and discipleship and pushing them to the edge. So we come to know God this way. Jesus says this crazy thing, which is what transformed me in college, because I'd been following the Dead Poets Society way of life, that happiness, sucking the marrow out of life was somehow where you were going to find the greatest joy. And it's like cotton candy. It just never satisfies. And Jesus comes along and says, obey my Father's commands, and I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and so that your joy may be complete. Your greatest happiness and satisfaction and flourishing as a human being is when you're operating the way God designed you to operate and obeying the commands to love others as he's asking you to do. So somehow when we do justice, we're giving our lives away, but we come to find the greatest happiness. If you talk to sociologists, they'll tell you that the people that give their lives away may be at the greatest risk for burnout, but they also show the highest levels of meaning and satisfaction and joy in life than the people that live consumeristically and selfishly. Jesus is begging us, imploring us to remain with him as we're obeying God's command to do justice and to love, and that in doing that, he's got this great, exciting thing that we're going to share in his joy. It's a beautiful call. So justice is ethical, it's epistemological, and it's existential. And this really matters because we've gotten this whole conversation mucked up in the United States. So real quickly, Jesus defines love here by saying that it's measured, the metric is in how you lay down your life for another person. In other words, Jesus is saying sacrificial love is how you see love get extended. It's how you measure it. In our society today, whether it's the poets, the Taylor Swifts, the movies, or even the way we talk, like I love a cheeseburger, or man, I love her, or whatever the cheesy ways we talk about it is, we're always referencing the same thing, is that love for us, the English word love, is a reference to the intensity of our longings or desires. It measures the degree to which we want something. Does that make sense? That's the way we use love, is it not? And by the way, as I've traveled internationally, every English-speaking group that I talk to, that's the way they're using the word love. That you measure it, the metric is somehow the intensity of my desire. So if I tell you I love something and then I say I love, love, love it, I didn't add any single word to the sentence, but you know what I'm doing. I'm ratcheting up and communicating to you that I have a greater intensity of desire than when I just said the word love one time. Fair enough? So here's the crazy thing. If I asked you what the definition of the English word lust is, do you know what it is? It's actually intensity of longing or desire. And so somewhere along the way in our consumeristic culture, we took the definition of the word lust and we pushed it into the meaning of the word love. And we did exactly what Paul said would happen. Our appetites became our God, and we worshiped our desires. And somehow, when our lives are not working out and we don't understand, we're like, I'm a good person. Why? Because I'm loving. What does that really mean? That I serve my own wants, wishes, and desires really well. And we don't understand that we've clunked it all up. And so justice, which is about other people, actually ends up becoming somehow self-referential as a way of us extending our own personal branding or our own way of magnifying ourselves, because we all want to look good in a society that cares about these kinds of things. So here's a picture of a t-shirt. I've got 4 daughters because God wanted me to really break down the patriarchy in my life. And so we were back to school shopping, which I hate. And we were in the store, and I stood up and I turned around and I saw this shirt. And so I took a picture of it. This is off my iPhone. And it's justice as a brand mark, made in Vietnam. And I think we understand the implications of that with regard to child labor and cheap labor. And this is for 7-year-olds, 7-year-old girls. And the message is, love yourself. We have got this thing so mucked up that we have to lean back in and dig deep into a theology of justice to get a foundation stone set so that when we move out and begin to act, it's not just compassion, it's not just feather dusting, it's not ultimately serving other people so that it can somehow be about me, it's not driving past the messy parts of my community so that I can get to the sexier ones. It's somehow reflecting the heart of God that says, if you give your life away for others, somehow in faith you can trust that I'll take care of and meet you there. Is that not what it means to know God? I'm out of time, so I'm going to pray for us. Father, would you bless this school and these students that are learning and growing? Fill them with your spirit and your knowledge. Grow their love, because we know that we love because we're first loved by you, that the love of Christ compels us to love. So as we go out this morning, fill us with joy, and we pray that in the name of your Son. Amen. Go in peace.